Imagine a society with a mandated system-wide reset for all personal debt every 7 years. And, picture an employment law that legally requires a boss to give departing workers enough capital to start their own competing business.
It sounds kind of wild, right?
It really does. Welcome to the Deep Dive. May God deeply bless your day, and honestly, may bless your entire week ahead as we get into this. We're thrilled you're joining us today.
Yeah, it is genuinely wonderful to be here. We are going to explore something that might seem, incredibly distant and ancient at first glance, but as you just hinted at, it's actually deeply, almost uncomfortably relevant to how we live right now.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into some really fascinating source materials. We are working with excerpts and extensive detailed study notes from 2 comprehensive Portuguese study Bibles.
Specifically, the Holman Study Bible and the NAA, which is the Nova Almeida Atualizada.
Exactly. And our focal point is one specific ancient text, which is Deuteronomy chapter 15.
Which, if you've never spent time in it, or if you just skim the ancient laws, it might sound like a dusty, irrelevant legal code.
Oh, totally.
But the mission of our deep dive today is to explore how this thousands of years old text tackled issues that are literally dominating our modern headlines right now. We're talking about systemic economic inequality, the necessity of social safety nets, the crushing weight of generational debt.
And the sometimes very ugly reality of human nature when money is on the line.
Yes, exactly.
I'm just so ready to unpack this because as we go through these notes, we're going to see that the ancient Israelites had this beautifully complex, heavily mandated economic reset button built directly into the rhythm of their society.
It's fascinating.
To understand their perspective on wealth, we really have to look at their broadest macroeconomic policy first. The text outlines something known as the Year of Remission.
Right.
And this happened like clockwork every 7 years.
And to really grasp the gravity of this, the Holman and NWA's study notes both highlight a crucial theological connection here. This 7-year cycle isn't just, an arbitrary number picked out of a hat.
No, it's tied to something bigger.
Exactly. It is a direct extension of the sabbatical principle. The fundamental idea in this culture is that just as creation itself was said to rest on the 7th day, the Sabbath, the economic machinery of the nation actually requires a hard rest in the 7th year.
Which is, we are so incredibly conditioned to an economy that demands constant, unending, quarter-over-quarter growth. The idea that a system, let alone an entire national economy, needs to just stop and breathe is wild.
It really flies in the face of modern capitalism. Now, the NAA notes do highlight a fascinating scholarly debate about the actual mechanics of this remission year.
Oh, right, about how the debt was actually handled.
Yeah, the debate centers on the exact nature of the debt relief. Scholars are divided on whether the debts were completely canceled, like literally forgiven, erased off the ledgers forever.
Which would be huge.
Huge. Or, on the other hand, if they were merely postponed and suspended for the duration of that one sabbatical year.
Okay, but either way.
Right. The notes emphasize something vital here. Regardless of which interpretation is historically accurate, the immediate lived experience for the debtor was identical.
The pressure was off.
Exactly. The crushing, suffocating burden of debt was lifted. During that year, a lender was legally forbidden from demanding repayment from a fellow Israelite.
Well, let me put this in modern terms for you, just to really feel the weight of this. Imagine an economic structure where every 7 years, there's an automatic society-wide bankruptcy declaration.
Oh, yeah.
Like the bank holding your mortgage, the servicer for your student loans, the issuer of your credit card. They are legally barred from collecting a single dime.
It's hard to even imagine.
It really is. It's an automatic wiping of the slate, or at the very least, a mandated year-long freeze on all payments and interest. It completely short-circuits the generational accumulation of debt that we see so often today, where poverty just becomes inescapable.
Yeah, it actively prevents a permanent underclass from forming. It stops a temporary misfortune from turning into permanent serfdom. Now, there is a caveat mentioned in the text that the study notes clarify.
The part about the foreigners.
Right. Foreigners visiting or conducting international trade were exempt from this specific remission rule.
Which, that sounds a bit discriminatory at first glance, doesn't it?
It definitely can read that way to modern eyes. But the notes point out the practical and theological logic behind it. Foreign merchants operated on entirely different economic
They
calendars.
weren't tied to the sabbatical system.
Exactly. They weren't bound by the broader Sabbath cycles, the agricultural rhythms, or the covenant of the land. They were transient. But for the internal, localized community of Israelites who were all participating in this shared agricultural economy, it was a hard, mandatory reset.
Okay, I understand the utopian appeal of that, but I have to push back here because I'm putting myself in the shoes of an ancient Israelite who happens to have, a surplus of grain or silver.
Okay, let's hear it.
If I know there's this grand economic reset button and all debts are going to be wiped or suspended in year 7.
And it currently happens to be year 6.
Yes. If it's year 6, I'm keeping my vault locked. Why would I lend my capital knowing the government is basically going to erase the debt in 12 months?
Mhm.
Doesn't this beautifully idealistic system just completely freeze up the credit markets in reality?
That is the exact tension that makes this text so brilliant. It doesn't live in a naive fantasy world at all. The biblical text actually anticipates your exact logic there.
Oh, it knows people are going to do that.
It knows that human beings are fundamentally motivated by self-preservation and profit. The text explicitly addresses this loophole. It warns the people, essentially saying, be careful that you don't harbor a wicked thought in your heart.
And the Holman notes have a really interesting linguistic deep dive on that phrase, that wicked thought, don't they?
They really do. They point out that this wicked thought is deeply associated with the Hebrew word Belial. In the ancient context, Belial implies something profoundly destructive, worthless, or even demonic.
Wow, demonic.
Yeah. The text specifically warns against having what it calls a malignant eye toward your desperately poor neighbor just because that 7th year of debt cancellation is approaching.
A malignant eye. That is a chilling, visceral phrase.
It paints a picture, doesn't it?
It perfectly captures that moment when you look at someone in desperate need, you do the cold calculus in your head, realize they are a terrible return on investment, and you just emotionally detach and close your wallet.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
It's the math of capitalism overriding the instinct of empathy.
And the command in Deuteronomy completely rejects that math. The instruction is to lend freely and generously, regardless of what the calendar says. You give them what they need to survive, even if you are fully aware that you're going to take a financial loss.
Which is a huge ask.
It's massive. And this brings up a profound philosophical collision highlighted brilliantly in the NAA study notes.
Yeah, it sets up this massive collision between a utopian ideal and gritty human reality. If you look at verse 4 of this chapter, the text states this incredible, sweeping ideal. It says, "There shall be no poor among you."
Right. And the notes explain that verse 4 represents the theoretical, logical result of perfect obedience to God's law.
If everyone actually did it.
Exactly. If an entire society actually operated with radical generosity, if everyone forgave debts without resentment and lent money without calculating the risk, systemic poverty would literally be eradicated.
But the text knows human nature way too well to stop there, because just a few paragraphs later in verse 11, it bluntly, almost painfully, acknowledges human failure.
It really shifts gears.
It says, "The poor will never cease from the land." It literally gives the blueprint for a perfect poverty-free society, and in the exact same breath admits, you are not going to pull this off.
The realism is striking, and the Holman notes draw a direct line from this ancient realism straight to the New Testament. They point out that Jesus later quoted this exact seemingly pessimistic reality in Matthew 26.11.
When he says, "The poor you will always have with you."
Yes. He isn't using that as an excuse to ignore poverty, which is how it sometimes gets misinterpreted. He is directly referencing this ancient Deuteronomy passage to acknowledge that human greed and that malignant eye will always fracture the ideal system.
Right.
Therefore, generosity can't just be an ideal. It has to be a constant, active practice.
Which perfectly sets up the next major mechanism in the text. Because if the ideal fails, if the malignant eye wins out, and an individual falls completely through the cracks into absolute desperate poverty, what is the ultimate safety net?
That's where it gets really interesting.
According to the NAA notes, when an Israelite fell into total destitution, they would essentially sell themselves to a wealthy landowner.
Now, we really need to pause and be exceptionally precise with our terminology here because the historical context provided by the sources is vital.
Definitely.
When a modern listener hears the phrase sell themselves, our minds instantly and rightfully go to the horrific race-based chattel slavery of the last few centuries.
Where human beings were treated as permanent property, stripped of all humanity and rights.
Exactly. But the study notes strongly emphasize that the system described in Deuteronomy was categorically different. This was debt servitude.
It was an act of extreme desperation for survival in a harsh agrarian world. I mean, if your crops fail, you have no land left to mortgage, and your family is starving, you enter into this servitude agreement to secure housing, food, and employment.
It was a survival mechanism.
To use a modern parallel, it's much closer to declaring a catastrophic Chapter 11 bankruptcy where your labor is temporarily garnished by your creditors rather than being legally reduced to a piece of livestock.
And the absolute most critical differentiator is the strict time limit. The law mandates that this debt servitude could only last a maximum of 6 years.
And then comes the seventh year.
Exactly. When that sabbatical reset hit in the 7th year, that servant had to go completely free. The master had no legal right to hold them a single day longer.
This leads us to that ancient severance package I teased at the beginning of our deep dive.
Oh, this is the best part.
Because the text adds a fascinating caveat. It says that when you release this worker in the 7th year, you cannot just show them the door empty-handed. You are legally required to supply them liberally.
Liberally is the key word there.
Right. The text specifically lists giving them provisions from your own flock, from your threshing floor, and from your winepress.
In academic terms, this is often called a manumission gift. Manumission literally means the act of releasing someone from your hand or control. And the NWA notes explain the deep economic logic behind this requirement.
It makes a lot of sense when you think about it.
It really does.
Yeah.
Think about the reality of the situation. If you just release a person who has been entirely dependent on your estate for 6 years and you give them 0 assets, what happens the next morning?
They just starve. Or they immediately have to walk down the road and sell themselves right back into servitude to a different landowner.
Exactly. Without capital, freedom is just a fast track back to crushing poverty.
So this required generosity was basically seed capital. It was an enforced redistribution of wealth designed to ensure the freed person could actually establish a new, independent life and not fall back into the cycle.
Furthermore, the text explicitly reminds the master not to feel bitter about this payout. It points out that over those 6 years, this servant provided labor that was worth double that of a standard hired hand.
So it isn't even just charity. It's a forced recognition of the profound economic value the worker brought to the master's estate.
Right, they earned it.
Think about the modern implications of this. Instead of a system of lifelong exploitation, this reads more like an extreme fixed-term employment contract that concludes with a mandatory massive severance package literally designed to help you start your own competing farm.
It's kind of amazing.
Imagine a modern corporation being legally mandated to give every departing lower-level employee enough capital to buy a house and start a small business just to ensure they never fall into poverty. The scale of that generosity is staggering.
It is staggering generosity encoded into national law. But having laid out this incredibly generous runway for independence, the text throws a massive curveball.
It really does.
It asks a question that completely upends our modern assumptions about labor and freedom. The sources reveal a fascinating exception. What if the servant flat out refuses to leave?
This part of the notes blew my mind. We just spent all this time talking about how mandatory, unalienable freedom in the 7th year is the entire point of the system.
Right.
But the text asks, what if the safety, the provision, and the mutual respect with the master are so profound that the servant actively prefers to stay?
And the text provides a pathway for that. It says that if a servant genuinely loves their master and feels completely secure in the household, they can choose to legally bind themselves to that family for life.
For life.
For life. And it's worth noting the text explicitly states this applied to both male and female servants equally.
But they didn't just, sign an ancient NDA or an employment contract extension. They had a highly specific, deeply physical, and very public ritual to make this permanent choice official.
Yeah, it was a very physical act. The master would take a sharp metal-pointed tool, typically used for punching heavy holes in leather, and they would pierce the servant's earlobe directly against the door of the house.
Which honestly sounds a bit brutal and primitive to us today.
It does sound intense.
But the Holman notes unpack the profound, beautiful symbolism operating beneath the surface here. This wasn't just a brutal branding of property.
No, not at all.
The Hebrew word used in this context for the judges or the authority witnessing at the door is Elohim, which is a word directly relating to God. The doorpost itself wasn't just a piece of wood. It likely represented the door of the tabernacle, the central sanctuary of the nation.
That completely transforms the ritual. It takes what could be seen as a mundane, permanent employment agreement and elevates it into a deep, sacred religious vow. It's an act happening before God.
The theology hidden in that act is incredibly moving. It highlights that true, lifelong devotion cannot ever be forced.
Right.
The 6-year term proves that. Devotion only means something, it only carries weight if you possess the total unhindered freedom to walk away, but you actively choose to stay.
It's a completely voluntary submission marked by a permanent physical symbol of belonging. You're saying, I am a permanent part of this house.
And this ancient imagery echoes loudly centuries later. The Holman notes make a brilliant theological connection to the New Testament here.
They do. They point out that the Apostle Paul almost certainly had this exact Deuteronomy imagery in his mind when he wrote his letters.
Wait, doesn't Paul talk about bearing marks on his body in his letter to the Galatians? Is he directly referencing this doorpost ritual?
Yes, in Galatians 6:17, Paul boldly calls himself a slave of Christ and says he bears the marks of Jesus on his body.
Oh, wow.
For a long time, people read that just as a reference to the physical beatings he endured. But within his cultural context, he is invoking the pierced ear, the ultimate mark of the servant who was perfectly free to go, but chose to stay forever out of pure love for the master.
That reframes Paul's entire theology.
Yeah.
He isn't saying he's a kidnapped victim of a cosmic dictator. He is saying he walked to the doorpost voluntarily. He wanted the mark.
Exactly.
Okay, taking a step back, we have looked at wiping out massive debts every 7 years, giving away huge amounts of livestock and grain as severance, and this intense culture of voluntary devotion. But this begs one final, massive question.
How do you actually get human beings to do this?
Yes. What psychological conditioning makes an entire society willing to take these massive financial hits? Because forgiving debts and freeing your absolute best laborers is objectively terrible for your bottom line.
That is the core question of any economic system based on generosity. How do you overcome the malignant eye? And the answer, according to our sources, is actually found in the final section of Deuteronomy 15, which, on a first read, seems like a completely random change of topic. It's a section about livestock, specifically the firstborn principle.
Yeah, the text just shifts abruptly, commanding the Israelites to consecrate or legally set apart all the firstborn males of their herds and flocks to the Lord.
The rules surrounding these animals are incredibly strict. You absolutely cannot put the firstborn ox to work pulling a plow. You cannot shear the wool off the firstborn sheep to make clothes to sell.
They have to be taken out of the economic machinery completely.
Completely. Instead of monetizing them, they are to be eaten annually in a celebratory communal feast before the Lord.
Think about the financial sacrifice of that. You're taking your prime agricultural assets, your absolute best potential return on investment, and you are actively choosing not to utilize them.
It's a huge loss of potential profit.
Although there is a very pragmatic rule about defective animals. The notes highlight that if the firstborn animal has a severe physical defect, like it's lame or blind, you are forbidden from sacrificing it. You can't offer the divine a damaged asset.
True, but the text ensures you don't waste it either. You are allowed to eat it at home, just like you would regular wild game, like a hunted gazelle or a deer.
Right.
But even then, there is a strict, non-negotiable rule. You must pour the blood out on the ground like water as a profound sign of respect for the life of the animal.
So connecting the dots here, how does giving up a healthy sheep actually explain the motivation for this sabbatical year and the massive severance packages? How does this overcome human greed?
Both the Holman and NAA study notes are very clear on the underlying mechanism here. This entire system of giving up your first and best isn't about God being hungry for sheep.
No, of course not.
It is fundamentally rooted in two psychological pillars, gratitude and memory. Specifically, the visceral memory of the Exodus.
So it's about retraining the brain through muscle memory.
Exactly. It is a constant physical annual reminder of how they became a free nation in the first place. The narrative is that God spared their firstborns in Egypt. God rescued them from crushing, brutal slavery when they had absolutely nothing.
I see it now. The logical through line is, you were a desperate slave who had zero capital, and God freed you and gave you a land. Therefore, when you have a servant who has zero capital, you must free them and give them capital. It is an economy entirely based on forced empathy. You cannot harbor a malignant eye toward a poor debtor if you are actively annually practicing the memory that you were once the ultimate poor debtor, totally reliant on a bailout from the divine.
You give up the firstborn animal to physically practice losing your wealth. It breaks the illusion of self-sufficiency.
Wow.
It reminds you that you aren't the ultimate owner of your land or your wealth. You are merely a temporary steward. Your wealth is an unearned gift.
That shifts everything.
And the Holman Notes draw one final beautiful thread from this ancient practice. This physical posture of offering your first and best and intentionally not hoarding everything for yourself is the absolute foundation for the New Testament call to believers.
It points straight to Romans 12.1, the call for believers to present their bodies as living sacrifices. The theological thread connects perfectly. It was never really about dead animals. It was always about cultivating a living, breathing posture of radical generosity.
If we synthesize everything we've explored today across these two study Bibles, Deuteronomy 15 proves it isn't just an ancient spreadsheet or a list of dry rules.
Far from it.
It's an entire cohesive economic structure driven by empathy, driven by communal memory, and driven by the deep recognition that human beings are meant to take care of one another, precisely because we know how fragile and dependent we all really are.
It is profoundly challenging to our modern sensibilities. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you step back into your day.
I love this part.
In our highly individualized, hyper-competitive modern world, where the ultimate goal is to protect our personal assets and maximize our individual returns at all costs, how radically different would our communities look if our financial decisions were fundamentally tied to the memory of our own past hardships? What if our local economy was built on a deep sense of shared communal survival rather than just individual accumulation?
It raises such an important, disruptive question about what we truly value as a society. It reminds us that there is always a different, perhaps much more human way to structure our lives and our businesses.
Maybe we all need to start actively looking for ways to hit that system-wide reset in our own relationships and communities. Find a way to give someone a reset button today.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it.
Well, that is all the time we have for this deep dive. As we wrap up, we both want to explicitly say that God blesses all of you listening.
Yes, God blesses all of you. It has been a true privilege exploring this ancient wisdom with you today.
We wish you incredibly well, and we cannot wait to explore more fascinating sources with you. Until the next deep dive, take care.